This is the Midway Business Podcast. Inspired by the turning point of the Battle of Midway, Butch Zemar, CEO of Elite Benefits of America, is on a mission to help small and mid-sized businesses win their own battles. And now, Butch Zemar.
Well, welcome back to the podcast today. I got Michael, is it Kupchak?
Kupchak, you got it right, man.
Yeah,
Perfect.
Yeah.
Not Kupchak. We get Kupchak sometimes, but Kupchak is right. So,
hey, at least you get some variations. I mean, I guess all our names do, but can you give our audience just a quick overview of who you are, where you come from, and what you're doing today?
Yeah. So, my name's Mike Kupchak. I come from the south suburbs of Chicago. I was raised in Pale Heights. Grew up and now live in Orland Park. Probably I don't know, going on maybe 20 some odd years professional experience out here, kind of working in a combination of, professional services, industry, kind of the financial services side, and also it's working as part of a regulator as well. So, a part educator too, adjunct lecturer at University of Illinois Chicago, which is where I graduated from for probably over 10 years at this point in time. Something that I really enjoy doing, as well as, being a youth coach for my two sons as well, and just kind of being able to kind of be part of sports, which I think were really a pivotal part of my youth, and something that I think as I've progressed in my career, you inherently know the people that have played team sports and those that have not, and kind of in that role aspect. So, but it's a little bit like kind of a background about myself. So.
Yeah. Well, we started talking about that, right? Dad's getting involved, and the kids, and obviously we're both doing the same thing in our mutual connection that connected us. They're heavily involved in their kids too. And so you're obviously UIC grad, and my wife's alumni as well. But I'm curious, obviously you got an accounting background, but so what led you to accounting background? I think you grew up in a small business. Can you talk about some of the aspirations that led you to that accounting degree?
Yeah, so I had, I grew up in a family-owned business. My, dad was a carpenter by trade, and eventually kind of parlayed that into building displays and things like that for the kind of the gift industry at that point in time. But, I had, from my mother's side, I had two uncles that were, certified public accountants and CPAs. And so, and accounting was always kind of this very solid path, I think, going forward. And obviously people refer to it as the language of business at times. And then, part of that I partnered with which is called information and decision sciences. So right around the time when I was going to school, in this kind of interesting full circle now, there was a requirement to have 150 credit hours to sit for the CPA exam. And then, lo and behold, now they're easing a lot of those requirements in different states because of just the number of accounting enrollment has really dropped over time. So I think they're, and that whole solution of the 150 just didn't work out as well as I think they thought it would. But so I mean, accounting was something I was, obviously interested in. I saw really my uncles kind of have success with it, so I kind of partnered in that. I always had a love of kind of computers, kind of. I was a little bit of a computer nerd back in the day, going back to MS-DOS and kind of, right. I'm really dating myself, but
yes.
And so when the 150 hours came up, I was like, well, maybe I'll take this combination of interweaving accounting and then what would be information systems, and those two it's worked out really well in my career because it's kind of a very great skill to have. So.
Yeah. So now the degree was called decision sciences, but you were calling it something different. What's the correlation there, and what's decision sciences?
Yeah. So different names, different colleges, right? So within the College of Business at UIC, there's what's called the Department of Information and Decision Sciences. And typically that kind of encompassed different areas. So it would be kind of your operations research, kind of management sciences, and then typically what's referred to as kind of your management information systems. So I kind of focus more on the management information systems route. So that was more of the databases and coding. And I would say back then kind of early stages of what would be data analytics, or now what is data science and, machine learning and, kind of the regenerative AI and everything that you hear all about with ChatGPT and Grok and all these other ones that are out there now. But so that was kind of just more of the technology side of the house without going heavy into the computer science kind of side or computer engineering or anything else like that. So it was kind of kind of to me, the way to get into kind of the tech space, but more from a business standpoint than that of a, kind of developer programmer aspect. So
do you think AI is going to change the world in front of us?
I have this conversation a lot. So I think it's, I think generative AI has advanced at lightning pace. I think it is something that is really good at augmenting the way that we do work. I don't fundamentally believe it's a replacement for everything. I do think there are opportunities to, automate a lot of information, but there was ways to automate this prior to the big evolution of kind of the generative AI that's out there right now. But I do think that there's ways to leverage it, but like not. I think there's ways that you shouldn't leverage it either. Like, I don't think you should use it as like a replacement for Google, which is what some people do. And I think because naturally, it gives you an answer and then you kind of take it at face value, or kind of where you used to go and search information, you'd find some good sources, you'd find some bad sources, you'd learn a little bit through the process. So I think it's like you kind of have to learn how to balance the two. And I think having some knowledge in the subject's helpful too, because then you can kind of evaluate like, more is this correct, or doing a little research beyond just what it gives you to kind of piece everything together a little bit better. So, but I think it will change. I just don't think it's going to replace everyone like every CEO is running around and saying right now. So,
How about CFOs, right? Have an accounting background. So, how is that going to be a blended between AI and accounting?
I think, I think there's a lot of, where I feel like in accounting is that there is a lot of standardization. There is a lot of reoccurring type of entries that, and transactions that happen on a month-to-month basis. There's a lot of work that's done. So I think the repetitive work, I think there's opportunities to, probably automate some of that and free up some more time for probably analysis. I know in my career, I've worked in roles where we've had to do really heavily reporting, and it just takes a lot of time just to put together even the report. So if you can really, expedite the speed at which you can create those reports and you can spend more time on actually analyzing it, like I think there's a lot of value in that, right? So I think like from a CFO perspective, I think there's a lot of value in terms of just kind of being able to take a lot of the, I would say more like lower value add activities that may take up a lot of time, expediting how those are getting done, and then freeing you up to do more of like the analysis, which I think is probably where the real value lies.
So you think a lot of what you just shared, do you think going back in time with growing up in the small family business, do you think that that could have been an advantage for them, or you think old school accounting should have worked just fine?
I think it's, I think we're creatures of habit, so I think it's like, I think, if I was to run the business, it would be different than the way my parents ran it. And I think that's probably true with any generational business. As people go on, they have different insights into things. Like fundamentally, I don't know. I mean, I think there's probably, insights that could have been gained, but maybe in certain sectors and certain businesses, it's probably more applicable than others. But, I think again, it's like, it's hard to go back and think about like, how it would be different. But yeah, I think there's probably value that could be added from it, for sure.
Yeah.
So
and you doing some teaching over at UIC, obviously you're staying up front on a lot of things that occur because you're teaching it to the next set of graduates that are coming down the pipe, and you're obviously still in the accounting background, but you teach a class in enterprise accounting. And so what are you seeing like at that level for the systems that are involved, and anything that's changing, not related to necessarily AI, but like what are you seeing like from your perspective, teaching other students?
I think the biggest thing, and I think what you're going to see, especially in higher education, number one, is changing a lot right now just because of the current environment we're in. But I think what you see is that, in the classes that I teach, accounting is very black and white at times. There's a lot of, there's a certain way we produce an income statement, a certain way we create a balance sheet, cash flow statement, whatever it may be. And I think, when you get into kind of more of like the enterprise accounting systems and so forth, there's a little bit more ambiguity. And I think in terms of kind of the logic and the way that you can process things. So I think to me, there's more critical thinking, which I think is really valuable. And I think that's a skill that like, in my classes that I've taught, I've tried to really, get students to really, kind of learn through more experiential learning than memorizing something. So that's really more hands-on application. And I think that's critically important. And I also think the kind of the element of having the kind of like critical thinking is important because, again, even using like generative AI and giving it a prompt, how do you structure that prompt? What questions do you ask, right? How are you approaching this? So I think those are areas where like I feel like, I try to focus in a lot. And I think some students struggle with that because, a lot of it is just like, here's a set of concepts. I need to memorize these concepts. I need to spit this out on an exam. Where it's more like, well, here's a set of principles. How do I apply these principles to the problem that I have, and trying to solve it. So that's kind of where I've seen it. I mean, I think technology's evolved over time. I think the role of the accountant's changed a lot. I think the ability to, wrangle larger amounts of data and feel comfortable with that, I think is really critical, and something that I still feel like, as much as I've, gotten older in my
Hmm.
career, as much as I would think like a lot of students would come out with these skills, they don't, right? So I think, and it's just kind of is something that I think even going forward, I've started to see some new classes where they're talking more about critical thinking, kind of like, formulating problems and so forth. So I think that will evolve a little bit. So
Yeah, I think you beat me to the punch. One of the questions I was going to ask you was, you went through school and became, for studying accounting, and not that you're that far from when you graduated, but like, are you noticing a difference from the accounting students that went to school when you were going to school and compared to now? Like, is there a huge difference? And what are those differences?
I think, this comes down to like, I think also kind of the generational subject too, right? At times. And I think
Mhm.
that's just kind of, I think what I've seen, and this will go back to kind of the view is like, I mean, one, I would never have challenged a professor.
Hmm.
And I find that, like some students now have no issue with authority whatsoever. And it's not to say, listen, I'm wrong at times. I'm not always perfect, right? But like, I think that's part of it. I also think just in terms of like, the ability to kind of like learn quickly, the ability to kind of like, take some self accountability at times. I think that's like effectively, missing. I think about it with my own kids too. And I have this conversation with my friends here, they're my peers, and like, how much is like, helping them without helping them too much to enable them not to like be successful as an adult. And I think that that's a balance that where, you see even a lot of students now is just managing and kind of like, how they manage their course load. A lot of those students are full-time, they could be full-time working and trying to go to college. So trying to balance that. And again, like, I think just students in general, it's just, I mean, it's a different generation. So I think it's just the way that I approach things versus the way that they approach things are a little different. Doesn't mean it's right or wrong, but like, I don't, sometimes I think the expectation, is that by some of the generation, maybe like, I tell you to work, you're going to do this work. Like that's just it. Like you're going to have to go through this grind, and this is part of the process. And whether or not it may be you think beneath you, or you think it's not, this is above, you're more skilled than this, or whatever it may be. Like it's just that's kind of the hard part, is that people are trying to kind of like, work through that at times. And I think students just don't, I don't know, maybe kind of just self-awareness and things like that. I don't want to start
Yeah,
labeling people,
yeah,
and it's
yeah.
I don't like being labeled myself, so I don't want to
Mm,
label other
sure.
generations, but I think it's
Mhm.
just, listen, like graduating now with everything going on, with everything, like everything's gonna be automated, this, that. I think it's a little scary. I think, it's gonna be challenging for students to go out there and find positions, I think in certain areas are going to be a little bit harder than others, so.
Yeah. And speaking of that, so what, like you're dealing with graduates or at least students at this current moment, but what are you seeing like what like the career opportunities are looking at, especially in the accounting world, because that's where you came from. Like how, you alluded to it a little bit, but like is there anything that's different that they should be expecting after they get through all the accounting classes?
I mean, I think the ability to not just think just about accounting, I think holistically understand the business, understand, kind of how the business functions, the processes, within the business, and really able to kind of understand the data aspect too. I think that's really the value proposition there, is being someone also that can solve problems. Not, a lot of people can identify problems, but very few can actually like, actually fix them, right?
Hmm.
So I think being a potential problem solver, I think is key. And, being able to drive through that and understanding, as you approach those problems too, looking at it like it's not to say, hey, this, what the way you've done it before is wrong.
Hmm.
It's like, well, here's a better way to do it, right? Just kind of the phrasing and approach. So I think that's, to me, just, asking questions, I think is critical. And I think obviously with a lot more of like the return to work too, I think obviously, part of it is, I think that's important too, because I think, again, it's like a lot of the relationships that I built early on in my career was because I was in an office with someone. I think it's different now that I'm an adult and, I have kids and everything else like that, where, being able to work from home or a hybrid environment, it makes sense because like you have a lot of family responsibilities and so forth. But like earlier in my career, it would have been hard because I probably would have made the lifelong friendships that I have on some levels right now. So
Sure. Yeah. And so are you seeing being in the school setting, are you seeing more interest in accounting or less interest compared to when you went to school?
I think it goes cyclical. So I think
Hmm.
like when I kind of graduated, and I graduated in 2003, so I'm dating myself. But like,
Hmm.
back then it was like, you had the internet, kind of like the dot-com, kind of like to me, the bubble that happened, right? So kind of the floor fell out from technology. And then also combined at that time too, you had kind of like Enron and WorldCom and some of the scandals that happened from a fraud perspective. So you had what was, Sarbanes-Oxley Act was passed, and that was kind of like some people refer to that as like the right to work for accountants. So that created a lot of demand. And I think right now, I think what you're seeing is like there was the big push to, go computer science, go this, kind of be a developer, go into work for big tech and all that. And now you see those companies are laying off and pulling back. And accounting is always kind of one of those more stable areas. So I think you start to see a little bit of an uptick in that right now. So, and I think it
Hmm.
just goes, I think it goes in cycles depending upon like how the business cycles are going as well. So,
Yeah. So you mentioned fraud. One of the classes you teach is the fraud examination. Yeah.
yep.
What's involved in that? And I guess what would be a purpose, in the real world, what you would use that for?
I mean, so like I spent, a number of years kind of working in forensic accounting and then, taught the class as well at UIC. But, I think purpose wise, it could be anything ranging from, I worked on divorce cases. I worked on, purchase price disputes where, someone's, buying a company, and then someone says, like, hey, the company's worth this much. And then all of a sudden the earnings aren't working out. So was something inflated? You have situations where, there's like bankruptcies and you're trying to figure out like what caused this bankruptcy. And you'll see money moving from one account to another entity to another, being used to pay for like a private plane. I mean, so kind of asset tracing. The thing I always enjoyed about kind of the forensic accounting side is that it's like, most accounting is very linear in nature, right? And fraud and forensics is more like mosaic. So it's kind of like putting these pieces of the puzzle together, and being able to tell a story, and and being able to tell a story in a way that makes sense to non-accountants, right? So I think that's kind of why I always kind of enjoyed it. It's a little bit of a different flavor of accounting than your normal traditional accounting. So.
Yeah, so obviously there's a lot of stuff going on out there, and you have a lot of experience trying to detect some of that fraud. And so it seems like it's on an ongoing basis. You think like businesses should look out more for it, or you think it's pretty leveled off, and as long as they put parameters in for place, they should be fine.
I always think like, what I say, most companies don't want to spend proactively on fraud and many companies will think they don't have fraud. I
Hmm.
think the reality is that many do have fraud at times. And just, you just don't have it, or you haven't seen it yet, or you haven't found it, right? So I think it's always something you have to keep an eye on. You always have to think about sometimes the people that you think you trust the most and have access to the most things are the ones that ultimately have the most opportunity to be able to kind of, you know, take control and do the things that they shouldn't do, right? So I think it's always something that like you have to, keep in the back of your mind, and and kind of just never. I'm not saying you have to micromanage, but you also kind of just have to be realistic that it can happen to anyone at any time, anywhere, right? So,
Hmm.
and I've seen it happen between family members. I've seen it happen in large businesses. I've seen it happen in small businesses. So it's just something to always kind of just keep an eye out for. Listen, if we could all find the fraud tool, I mean, somebody would be rich and there would be no fraud. But I mean, there's always, I think the thing about fraud is that, and fraudsters in general is that they're very bright. They figure out ways to kind of get around the controls, and
Hmm.
they figure out different creative ways to kind of like commit the frauds. And I think that's like, it's what keeps it very interesting, but also it's the hard thing to kind of maintain, and in terms of kind of trying to fight and combat too, and especially with the evolution of AI now too, and some of what it's doing, especially from like the cyber end and things like that as well. It's just going to get more complicated, and over time, I think so.
Yeah, you think a lot of these small businesses will be able to handle a lot of this in house, or you think more and more companies are going to be out there supporting that?
I think, traditionally from like a fraud and forensic standpoint, I think, like your insurance companies, things like that would have kind of more in-house, your banks, but like, smaller companies, I think you're probably not using it until you feel like you have a need to. Obviously, on the insurance side, there's a lot of
Mm.
investigators in
Yeah.
insurance just because of the nature of it. So I think it's very industry specific, but I think it's also one of those things like where if you do have those situations, you want to find yourself a proper, forensic accountant, and be able to gauge them and understand like, again, how much good money do you want to put after bad money too? So
Hmm.
like you've lost as much how much you want to go to kind of go forward. And then also reputational risk, if that's as well a concern you always have to think about too. So
Yeah. Well, and if not that we get a whole lot of students listening to this, but like if you were to go back to even to tell your young self, looking at an accounting background or degree, or some of your students, what are some advice if they're getting into the accounting world?
I think accounting, when you can partner it with something else, like especially I did the information decision sciences, I think is extremely valuable. So I think being able to be multidisciplinary is really beneficial. And I think learning how to like, even if you don't want to be a programmer, and listen, it's a lot easier to program now with generative AI. You can pretty much kind of have it generate code for you and work with it. But understanding that as well, I think is really important because it kind of gives you that critical thinking component, right? Like troubleshooting and understanding why something's broken or why something's not working. I think that's really important to understand because, a lot of it's really easy to solve the problems that we already have answers to. It's really hard to solve the problems that we don't have answers to. And I think just learning that approach kind of and developing your own approach to kind of solve those problems, I think is really beneficial. So
Yeah. So I'm curious, our kids are around the same age, and you obviously have a passion for teaching. Otherwise, you wouldn't be teaching what you're teaching, especially accounting. Who wants to sit down and look at numbers? But how's that? I'm curious. How's the kitchen table with these kids? Are you walking them through some algebra, or are you just doing some kid sports stuff?
like my kids is very interesting because like my older son, so he's 13 right now. He'll be going into eighth grade. He'll be 14 here in September. He's like very into, he wants to be a mechanical engineer. He loves Legos. He likes to, we've got like a 3D printer. He'll work with that. I love working a lot of like small engines and things like that. So we take stuff apart, we modify things. He already takes apart Nerf guns and modifies them and does stuff. So we kind of like, we don't like, I think conversationally, we just kind of like, I always teach my kids a lot, kind of on the essentially a lot on the sports side too, just kind of like the mental performance side of things too.
Mhm.
So like in terms of like, how do we work through adversity? Like how do we kind of like control the process? Things that control the controllable. So I think I try to apply that to them like is life lessons of like, you're going to work through things at times that are hard and challenging. And it's when you've known failure, to me, you build confidence as you overcome it versus being someone that's always had success and never failing. How do you deal with that when you, let's say, all of a sudden you've been the stud your entire life and all of a sudden you're in high school and like you're really struggling. You don't know what it means to struggle, right? So like those are topics. My 10-year-old's interested in a lot more other stuff where, he wants to he always said he wanted to be a SWAT team guy, but he's the one that like he'll wrestle. He did wrestling last year. He did soccer and things like that. So, I just try to teach them like, be empathetic, understand people. People are at the core of, everything, whether or not, and ultimately do what you try to do something that you love, right? Something that you're, really passionate about, because, it's a long career and a long life. And you want to be able to do that. And, and like we're big about, you make commitments, you honor them, like,
Mhm.
and I think that's part of being a coach too, is that you're always there. So like
Yeah,
your kids learn to always be there and always be present. So like those are things that like we try to instill in them, and again, just if they need help with things or they're struggling, you can ask for it, right? There's nothing wrong with that, right? We can get you the resources and the access to things that you need. So like those are things that we, I don't try to like nail down any subject or try to quiz them. This isn't like, I may teach at a university, but I'm not like a PhD kind of typical person. I'm just trying to, to me, it's like, what's your thought process
yeah,
and kind of how do you approach that going forward? And I just, to me, I always have a curious mind. And I think that's something I try to encourage in them. So
for sure. But I am curious on how your little guy came up with squat team,
I,
or SWAT team rather. Yeah.
he was always really interested in like the military, so like,
Hmm.
he likes military. My wife has some German heritage, so he loves like he affiliates with that the most. He's got like shirts that say like, American born, German roots. It's kind of funny. But like, he is somebody that just like, I don't know, it's something that like I think really resonated with him. I don't know. He likes to, be kind of like on the move and stuff. And I think that's really important at times because like, he was diagnosed like last year with like ADHD. So like, I think that was something that like for him to be active, to be engaged, to do things, I think that kind of like aligns with his personality. So I think that it's really important. I think like when you go choose careers at times, like, listen, I may have majored in accounting, but I'm the furthest thing from an accountant. Like if I did I've done Myers-Briggs tests, and I'm like an ENFP and like most accountants are ISTJs. So like I'm the complete opposite, right? But like now that I know that, like, and I understand who I am and I understand who I'm working with, like I can tailor my approach. And I think that's part of what, with my kids too. And, I understand it's like do things that like fit to your personality because I think it's really important, right? So I think there's plenty of like C students that are really good in sales and make a killing in life because they're just really good at talking to people, engaging with people. So I think it's really important to kind of like do things that really fit who you are, right? And I think that's a hard question to answer at times when you're younger, but like as you evolve, it's like understanding who you are. Temet Noske is kind of something I live by, know thyself. And I think it's important that like, for my kids to like do that. And if he wants to be a SWAT team guy and jump out of a, armored vehicle and do that, like I'm more than supportive of that. I don't know if that's what it'll ultimately do, but it's just something that like I think he always really enjoyed. So
I was say with my kids, it seems like they change what they want to do later if they're talking about it, at least. Yeah, they keep changing over and over, and they should, right? Like you said, the creativity has got to be there, the curiosity has to be there, and then obviously the parent to support them and love them and keep encourage them and then keep them busy, right? Because screen time is going nuts these days, and I almost want to sell it to them versus giving it to them, but that's a different topic for a different day. But Michael, I appreciate your time on this. I actually think I was thinking while you were talking that we should get James and do a three-way podcast and we could talk about youth sports because all three of us are knee deep into all these youth sports and the nuances that go with it. I appreciate, everything you do. Like we started out the conversation, I appreciate what you do for a living and, and everything else that you shared with us. So I appreciate it. And maybe we'll get the three of us together.
No, I listen, one, I appreciate the opportunity to come on here and chat with you. And I definitely would love to talk about youth sports because I think it's a hot topic for, those that are involved, obviously on the coaching side and as parents. And I think it's something where, the sports that, let's say like we grew up with is so much of a different dynamic now, and just the pressures and everything else like that, the parents feel at times as well as like the kids and kind of like, like trying to, get into high school. And then if you want to play beyond that and, what's the right age and how much training should you do and everything else. And then, just kind of those sides. So, I mean, it definitely would love to have a conversation around that. So,
yeah, for sure. We'll definitely do it. I appreciate your time.
All right, man. Take care.